The room was supposed to clap. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Soft applause at first. Polite. Controlled. The kind of applause that rolls through an awards hall like background noise. As predictable as the lighting cues and the teleprompter scroll. But on this night, at the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards, something went wrong. Terribly wrong. Because instead of applause, something else rose up from the crowd. A sound Hollywood almost never makes. Booing. And not the playful kind. Not ironic. Not misunderstood. This was sharp. Loud. Unmistakable. The kind of sound that freezes smiles mid-expression and turns carefully rehearsed confidence into raw, unfiltered shock. Prince Harry heard it first. Meghan Markle felt it immediately. And the cameras, for a split second too long, captured a moment they were never meant to. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever watched someone realize, in real time, that the room has turned against them? That was this moment. But here's the thing no one tells you yet. The boos weren't the beginning. They were the release. The pressure valve snapping open after years of tension, contradiction, and carefully managed narratives colliding with a restless audience that had finally had enough. And tonight, we're unpacking exactly how it came to this. Not just what happened on that stage. Not just who booed, or why. But what this moment says about fame, sympathy, power, and the dangerous illusion that public goodwill lasts forever. Because this wasn't just uncomfortable television. It was a cultural fracture. And it didn't happen by accident. Let's rewind. Awards shows are designed to feel spontaneous, but they're anything but. Every entrance is mapped. Every applause break anticipated. Every reaction shot pre-selected. In the hours before the Critics' Choice Awards began, producers had already rehearsed the beats of the night. Who would get standing ovations? Who would get polite applause? Who would get emotional packages set to piano music? And Prince Harry and Meghan Markle? They weren't supposed to be controversial anymore. That's the part that matters. By 2026, the industry believed the storm had passed. The interviews had aired. The documentaries had streamed. The memoirs had sold. The debates had cooled into background noise. Hollywood thought it knew how to handle them now. Respectful, distant, controlled. But audiences don't move on the same schedule as publicists. Audiences remember patterns. They remember contradictions. They remember repetition disguised as revelation. They remember being asked, again and again, to feel something they no longer feel. And that's where the tension began. Because sympathy, when stretched too thin, doesn't just fade. It curdles. Think about it. How many times can a story be retold before it stops sounding like truth and starts sounding like branding? How many times can pain be repackaged before people wonder who's still hurting and who's profiting? These aren't comfortable questions. But they were already hanging in the air long before Harry and Meghan ever stepped into that auditorium. And on this night, the air was heavy. The Critics' Choice Awards pride themselves on being different. Less stuffy than the Oscars. Less chaotic than the Golden Globes. Smarter. More in touch. The audience isn't just celebrities. It's critics, insiders, people who trade in judgment for a living. That matters. Because critics don't clap out of obligation. They react. And reactions, once triggered, are impossible to fully control. When the couple arrived, cameras caught them smiling. Polished. Calm. Meghan poised. Harry slightly stiff but composed. To a casual viewer, everything looked normal. But behind the scenes, something else was already happening. Whispers. Side glances. Phones lighting up with messages from other tables. A subtle shift in energy that doesn't show up on broadcasts, but is unmistakable if you've ever been in a room full of people who suddenly share the same unspoken thought. Something like, is this really happening? Because for some in that room, Harry and Meghan represented more than themselves. They represented a decade-long argument about privilege and victimhood, truth and exaggeration, sincerity and strategy. And no matter which side you fall on, one thing is undeniable. People were tired. Tired of being told how to feel. Tired of being cast as villains for asking questions. Tired of a story that never seemed to end, only to rebrand itself with new titles and new platforms. And that exhaustion doesn't always show up as silence. Sometimes it shows up as boos. Now imagine being Prince Harry in that moment. A man raised in ceremony, trained to read rooms where displeasure is hidden behind smiles and protocol. A man who once stood on palace balconies while millions cheered his name. Hollywood is different. There is no script for rejection here. No centuries-old etiquette to soften the blow. When the sound hit, it hit fast. And here's the most unsettling part. For a brief second, no one knew how to react. Not the hosts. Not the audience. Not even the broadcast team. Because booing at an awards show breaks the social contract. It forces everyone to choose. Join in, cover it up, or pretend it isn't happening. That hesitation you saw on screen, that half-second of confusion before the camera cut away, that was real. And Meghan? She knew immediately. Watch her face closely in those first moments. Not the smile, the eyes, the calculation, the rapid adjustment, the shift from expectation to assessment. This wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Recognition that something long predicted, long denied, had finally arrived. And here's the contradiction that makes this moment so powerful. Harry and Meghan built their modern public identity around being heard, around breaking silence, around speaking when others wouldn't. But now, the audience was speaking back, loudly, and suddenly, the dynamic had flipped. No longer storytellers in control of the narrative. They were characters inside a moment they couldn't edit, couldn't reframe, couldn't release with a carefully worded statement the next morning. This was live. This was raw. This was irreversible. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw public opinion turn so visibly, so audibly, in real time? Not through polls. Not through think pieces. Through sound. Because boos aren't intellectual. They're emotional. They come from the gut. They bypass filters and land straight in the chest. And for an industry built on applause, boos are a kind of social alarm. They signal not just disagreement, but rupture. That's why this moment matters beyond celebrity gossip. It exposes a deeper shift in how audiences relate to public figures, in how empathy is granted, withdrawn, and sometimes weaponized, in how the line between authenticity and performance has become almost impossible to see. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Some people in that room felt sorry for them. Others felt vindicated. Many felt both at the same time. Because human reactions are messy. And Hollywood, despite its polish, is full of people who recognize when a story has run longer than its emotional warranty. But the real story of this night doesn't begin with the boos. It begins with what came before them. With quiet warnings. With ignored signals. With a belief that narrative control could outlast public patience. And it doesn't end when the cameras cut away. It unraveled. Slowly. Quietly at first. The kind of unraveling you don't notice until it's already too late to stop it. Because the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards didn't begin with boos. They began with confidence. With rehearsed smiles. With that familiar Hollywood hum that says, everything is under control. Until it wasn't. Here's the truth people forget. Award shows are not just ceremonies. They are ecosystems. Fragile ones. Every sound, every laugh, every clap feeds the next moment. When one reaction goes wrong, it infects the room. And on this night, the infection spread fast. Let's set the scene properly. The venue glowed the way these venues always do. Golden lights, reflective surfaces, polished floors that make even cynicism look glamorous. Celebrities filtered in with the practiced ease of people who know exactly where they belong. The air buzzed with overlapping conversations, box office numbers, streaming deals, whispered rivalries, forced congratulations. This crowd wasn't random. Critics, actors, producers, executives. People who spend their lives judging stories. People who can smell a narrative shift before it makes headlines. That matters. Because when Harry and Meghan took their seats, they weren't just being watched. They were being assessed. From the outside, everything looked normal. They smiled. They nodded. Meghan adjusted her posture with that familiar composure that reads as confidence to some, calculation to others. Harry leaned in to speak to her, his body angled slightly away from the aisle, a subtle gesture of retreat most people missed. But the room noticed. Energy is invisible, but it's loud if you know how to listen. And the energy around them wasn't warm. It wasn't hostile either. It was something more dangerous. Unresolved. The show rolled on. Jokes landed. Some fell flat. Applause rose and fell in predictable waves. The broadcast flowed smoothly, as planned. No one at home would have suspected anything unusual. Then came the moment. Not a major award. Not a climactic speech. Just a segment that required acknowledging their presence. A standard line. A cue. A beat designed to pass without incident. The kind of moment producers don't worry about. Until the sound hit. It didn't start as a roar. It started as a murmur. A low, uncertain noise from one corner of the room. The kind of sound that makes people glance sideways before reacting. Was that? Then another voice joined. Then another. Within seconds, it was unmistakable. Booing. You could feel the collective inhale. The audience sucked in air as one organism, shocked not just by the sound, but by itself. Because booing isn't just an expression. It's a decision. And once it starts, it demands a response. Prince Harry's head snapped up. That's not speculation. That's visible on the raw footage before the cut. A reflex. A man trained to register threats, even social ones, instantly. Meghan's reaction was different. She didn't jerk. She stilled. Stillness can be louder than motion. Around them, people froze. Some clapped harder, instinctively trying to drown out the noise. Others stared straight ahead, pretending not to hear. A few looked directly at Harry and Meghan, curiosity overpowering discretion. This is the part viewers at home never fully grasp. In that moment, no one knew what the correct reaction was anymore. And when social rules collapse, real emotions leak out. The boos grew louder. Not thunderous, but persistent. Enough to break the illusion. Enough to force the broadcast team into panic mode. Cameras cut. Too fast. Anyone who's worked live television knows that kind of cut isn't elegant. It's defensive. It screams, abort mission. But sound doesn't obey edits. For a few seconds, the microphones caught everything. And in those seconds, something irreversible happened. Because applause can be manufactured. Silence can be spun. But boos? Boos are honest. And honesty is dangerous in a room built on performance. Harry's face shifted. Not dramatically. No tears. No outrage. Just confusion sliding into something heavier. Disbelief, maybe. Or the sudden realization that he wasn't misreading this. This was real. Meghan leaned toward him. Not to smile. Not to wave. To speak. We don't know what she said. Lip readers have tried. Insiders have speculated. But the content matters less than the urgency. She knew the moment needed managing. The irony is brutal when you think about it. For years, their story revolved around being misunderstood. Around being silenced. Around fighting institutions that controlled narratives. Now they were in a room where the narrative slipped out of everyone's hands at once. And the institution couldn't save them. The host stumbled forward, voices a little too bright, pacing slightly rushed. Laughter followed, thin and uncertain. The show moved on, because it had to. But the room didn't reset. Once a crowd crosses that line, you can't uncross it. People whispered. Phones came out beneath tables. Group chats lit up. Not with outrage, but with shock. Did that just happen? Yes, it did. And here's the part that complicates everything. Not everyone booed. Some people clapped harder than ever. Some looked genuinely uncomfortable, even sympathetic. Some were furious, not at Harry and Meghan, but at the audience for breaking decorum. Because Hollywood has rules. Unspoken ones. And one of them is simple. You don't humiliate guests on live television. But another rule exists too. You don't ignore the audience forever. This moment exposed a fault line between industry etiquette and public sentiment. Between what insiders think should happen and what people actually feel. And fault lines, once exposed, widened fast. Backstage, producers scrambled. You could see it in the pacing of the show afterward. Segments tightened. Speeches shortened. The rhythm fell off, like a band playing after losing the beat. Because something had gone wrong, and everyone knew it. Harry and Meghan stayed seated. No dramatic exit. No visible confrontation. That restraint mattered. It prevented the moment from escalating further. But it also trapped them inside it. Leaving would have confirmed weakness. Staying confirmed endurance. Neither option felt like a win. Ask yourself this. What would you do? Stand and wave? Risk more boos? Smile through it? Look detached? Leave? Be accused of arrogance? Every move carried risk. And for the first time in a long time, they didn't control which risk they took. As the show continued, reactions rippled outward. Other celebrities adjusted their behavior. Some leaned into applause for unrelated moments, overcompensating. Others stayed subdued, unwilling to add noise to an already unstable room. The camera avoided Harry and Meghan after that. Deliberately. Almost aggressively. No reaction shots. No cutaways. They were visually erased while physically present. And that, perhaps, was more telling than the boos themselves. Because invisibility in Hollywood is a warning. It says, we don't know how to handle this yet. But the night wasn't over. And neither was the fallout. Because while the audience at home saw only fragments, something else was happening in real time. Something faster, louder, and far less controllable. The internet had woken up. Clips began circulating before the segment even ended. Grainy phone footage. Muted audio amplified. Captions filled in the gaps. Interpretations multiplied. And as the digital noise grew, the physical room grew quieter. People sensed it. That strange moment when you realize a story has escaped its container. Harry glanced around again. This time, not searching for confirmation, but for allies. For familiar faces. For reassurance that the room hadn't fully turned. Some met his gaze. Some didn't. Meghan's posture remained composed, but tighter now. Shoulders squared. Chin lifted. The look of someone bracing for impact, not retreating from it. And that's where the chapter truly ends. Not with the boos themselves, but with the silence that followed. Because silence after noise is where meaning settles. And what that silence meant, what it revealed about the room, the industry, and the couple at the center of it all, would only become clear when we examine why this moment didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building. For years. That's not an opinion. It's a rule. Unwritten, unspoken, but deeply understood by anyone who's ever sat in one of those velvet-covered seats under hot stage lights. You clap. You smile. You stand when you're supposed to. Even when you disagree. Even when you're bored. Even when you quietly despise the person being honored. Especially then. So when boos cut through the air at the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards, the shock wasn't just about who was being booed. It was about the rule being broken. Because booing in Hollywood isn't just rude. It's radioactive. It exposes something the industry works very hard to conceal. Honest, collective rejection. And that's why this moment hit so hard. To understand why, you have to understand how rare this actually is. Think back. Truly think. How many times have you heard sustained booing at a major award show? Not awkward silence. Not lukewarm applause. Not polite clapping that fades too fast. Actual boos. You can probably count them on one hand. Awards shows are built to prevent that exact outcome. Guest lists are curated. Seating charts are political documents. Producers know who sits where, who supports whom, who needs buffering. The room is engineered to behave, which makes this question unavoidable. If booing is almost impossible, how did it happen here? The answer is uncomfortable, because booing doesn't emerge from ignorance. It comes from certainty. People don't boo what they don't recognize. They boo what they believe they understand. And by 2026, a significant portion of the audience believed they understood Harry and Meghan's story far better than the industry was willing to admit. But let's slow down. Hollywood's relationship with booing is shaped by fear. Fear of unpredictability. Fear of losing control. Fear of revealing that the audience isn't always aligned with the narrative being presented on stage. That fear has a long history. When actors give controversial speeches, the cameras cut to applause. When someone wins an unpopular award, the band plays louder. When tension rises, humor is deployed like anesthesia. The goal is simple: smooth everything over. And it usually works. Even during scandals, even during backlash cycles, Hollywood prefers silence to confrontation. Silence can be reframed later. Booing cannot. Booing says, right now, in this room, we reject this. No press release can undo that. Which brings us back to the Critics' Choice Awards. This wasn't a random crowd pulled from the street. These were critics and insiders. People whose professional identity is built on evaluation. On calling things out. On saying, publicly, when something doesn't work. That alone changes the math. Critics are less invested in maintaining illusions. They don't depend on celebrity goodwill in the same way. Many of them have already been accused of bias, cruelty, elitism. They've made peace with being disliked. So when a critical mass of that room felt a reaction rising, the usual internal brakes didn't engage fast enough. But why then? Why Harry and Meghan, specifically, and why now? Here's the contradiction that sits at the center of this story. Hollywood initially embraced Harry and Meghan because they represented disruption with a moral gloss. Royalty rejecting tradition. A fairy tale reframed as liberation. Power being challenged from within. It was irresistible. They were welcomed not just as celebrities, but as symbols of progress, of courage, of truth-telling. But symbols are fragile. They demand consistency. And over time, cracks appeared. Not necessarily because everything they said was false, but because repetition changed the emotional impact. The same grievances resurfaced across different platforms, framed as new revelations each time. The same villains reappeared, unnamed but unmistakable. The same pain was revisited, monetized, serialized. Audiences noticed. And audiences have limits. There's a moment when empathy quietly expires. Not because people become cruel, but because they feel manipulated, asked to feel something on demand, told that if they question the story, they are part of the problem. That kind of moral pressure works for a while, until it doesn't. By the time the Critics' Choice Awards arrived, many in that room had already absorbed months of cultural fatigue. Think pieces questioning authenticity. Critics revisiting timelines. Audiences rolling their eyes at yet another exclusive insight that felt suspiciously familiar. The industry sensed it, too. Projects stalled. Invitations became less enthusiastic. Praise softened. Support became conditional. But none of that is visible on a red carpet. What is visible is applause. And applause, for a long time, kept coming. Until this night. Because booing doesn't require unanimity. It requires momentum. A few voices. Then a few more. Then the realization that you're not alone. That's the psychological tipping point. And once crossed, social restraint collapses. There's another layer that made this moment uniquely volatile. Expectation. Harry and Meghan weren't there as underdogs. They weren't outsiders crashing a system that didn't want them. They were guests. Invited. Positioned. Framed as important. That creates resentment when public sentiment no longer aligns. People are far more forgiving of those who struggle upward than those who continue to command attention despite waning goodwill. In other words, the boos weren't just about disagreement. They were about presence. Why are they still here? Why are we still being asked to care? Why is this story still being treated as unresolved? Those questions may sound harsh, but they were already being asked quietly in living rooms long before they were shouted, however briefly, in that hall. And here's where Hollywood's rulebook failed. Producers assumed the room would behave as it always had. That decorum would override discomfort. That politeness would suppress frustration. They miscalculated. Because the Critics' Choice audience isn't the Oscars audience. It's less dazzled, less deferential, more opinionated, and crucially, less patient. Add to that the broader cultural context of 2026, a time when audiences are increasingly skeptical of curated authenticity. When social media has trained people to spot performance. When backlash cycles move faster than PR teams can respond. This wasn't just booing a couple. It was booing a format. The format of endless confession without resolution. The format of moral authority without accountability. The format of pain as brand. And that's why the moment landed like it did. But let's be clear about something important. Booing doesn't mean universal hatred. Many people still sympathize deeply with Harry and Meghan. Many believe the reaction was cruel, unnecessary, even bullying. Some argue it crossed a line of basic decency. Those reactions are valid. What makes this moment significant is not moral agreement. It's emotional consensus. Enough people in that room felt something strongly enough, simultaneously, to break a rule that Hollywood has enforced for decades. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when silence becomes harder than noise. And once noise exists, it demands interpretation. Was this a protest? A backlash? A misjudged moment amplified by nerves? Or was it something else entirely? Because there's a possibility no one wants to confront yet. That the booing wasn't aimed at Harry and Meghan as individuals, but at what they had come to represent. A symbol that no longer fit the mood of the room. And symbols, once rejected, are rarely reclaimed. The industry knows this. Which is why the reaction afterward was so careful, so measured, so evasive. No one rushed to condemn the audience. No one rushed to defend the couple publicly. Statements were delayed. Words were chosen cautiously, because Hollywood sensed danger. Not danger to Harry and Meghan alone. Danger to the system that elevated them. Because if audiences feel empowered to break decorum once, they may do it again. And next time, the target could be anyone. Which brings us to the most unsettling question of all. If this booing was not spontaneous, if it was the result of years of quiet erosion, then what exactly triggered it that night? Why didn't it happen earlier? Why not at a premiere? Why not at a press event? What specific tension finally tipped the balance? The answer doesn't lie in the room. It lies in the days before it, in decisions made offstage, in stories released at exactly the wrong time, in a backstory the crowd hadn't forgotten, no matter how hard the industry tried to move on. And that's what we need to confront next. Because once you understand what the audience was really reacting to, the boos stop being shocking. They start making a disturbing kind of sense. They boo a memory. And that's exactly what happened at the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards. The audience wasn't just reacting to a couple walking onto a stage. They were reacting to a decade-long story compressed into a single evening. A story they had followed, analyzed, debated, and, frankly, grown exhausted by. To understand why the booing erupted that night, you have to rewind further than the red carpet. You have to look at the backstory, the moments, the decisions, the controversies that left the public weary and primed for a visceral reaction. Because nothing happens in isolation. Let's start with the narrative arc. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's story has been relentless. From the royal wedding that captured global attention, to the early media scrutiny, to their move to North America, to the explosive interviews and documentaries that followed. Every chapter invited scrutiny, judgment, and strong opinion. Audiences watched, fascinated, sympathetic, skeptical, and often conflicted. They were asked to invest emotionally over and over again, to choose sides in a drama that spanned continents and media formats. And they did, for a while. But repetition has a cost. Every exclusive interview, every Netflix special, every carefully controlled memoir that rehashed grievances built toward fatigue. The story, once fresh and compelling, began to feel cyclical. Audiences recognized the patterns. They started predicting the reveals, the tragedies, the moral dilemmas. They noticed the narrative cues, the strategic leaks, the perfectly timed media appearances. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and when a story repeats too often, empathy diminishes. It's not cruelty, it's psychological conservation. People can only feel so much sorrow, outrage, or sympathy before their emotional bank account closes for deposits. And by 2026, a significant portion of Hollywood's audience, critics, insiders, and fans, had reached that point. Now add to that the Hollywood ecosystem itself. Hollywood is a paradoxical place. It celebrates rebellion, outsider perspectives, and authenticity, but only within the limits of what is profitable, entertaining, and socially manageable. You are allowed to break rules, but only if the audience cheers. You are allowed to challenge norms, but only if no one calls you out. You are allowed to be polarizing, but only in measured doses. And when someone pushes too far, or too often, fatigue sets in. The applause dries up. The laughter fades. And when the audience no longer feels compelled to participate, disruption turns to backlash. Which brings us back to the Critics' Choice Awards. The couple had been welcomed as symbols of modernity, liberation, and courage. Hollywood celebrated their story. They were guests, partners, collaborators. They were carefully framed as protagonists in a tale the industry wanted to tell. The royals who broke tradition and redefined celebrity power. But symbols are fragile, and the moment they no longer resonate, they become targets. That's the paradox of celebrity. The higher you climb, the louder the silence feels when it turns. The room at the Critics' Choice Awards didn't hate them personally. They were disappointed. They were exhausted. They were ready to assert their collective opinion that the story had overstayed its welcome, and the boos were the only way to express it in a controlled environment. But there was another factor, one that is rarely discussed openly. Timing, context, external triggers. Days before the event, a media leak had reignited debate over a controversial decision. A public appearance Harry and Meghan had made, framed as charitable, but interpreted by some as tone-deaf or self-serving. Add to that social media chatter, clips from prior events resurfacing, and subtle narrative nudges from industry insiders, and the atmosphere was primed. The audience arrived ready. Not to celebrate, but to judge. And when the moment came, the reaction was immediate. The initial murmur of disapproval quickly gained momentum. In a room full of critics trained to react, one hesitant boo was quickly joined by others. It became a wave, and then a roar, enough to break the scripted rhythm of the show. Cameras cut, producers panicked, and the couple was suddenly caught in a storm they couldn't edit or frame. Now imagine being Prince Harry in that moment. A man who spent his life learning the art of ceremonial poise, trained to navigate the scrutiny of millions. In that split second, he was human, vulnerable, exposed, a man facing collective judgment he had not anticipated. And Meghan? She was the strategist, the observer, the calm exterior. But subtle shifts in posture, glances, and micro-expressions betrayed recognition of the tension and the calculation of what came next. She knew the room had changed. The narrative control had slipped. And the audience had spoken, loudly and clearly. Here's the unsettling truth. This wasn't just a night of boos. It was the public holding up a mirror, a reflection of fatigue, skepticism, and frustration. It was the audience asserting agency in a story they had been asked to invest in repeatedly. And for Hollywood, that is terrifying. Because the system relies on controlled reactions, curated sentiment, and the illusion of universal admiration. Once that cracks, the structure itself is threatened. Some insiders argue that this reaction was a warning, an implicit critique of the couple, yes, but more broadly a critique of narrative manipulation and celebrity branding. Others see it as a natural social response, an audience finally speaking up after years of mediated experiences. Either way, the consequence is the same. For the first time, public sentiment disrupted the carefully orchestrated flow of the show. And disruption, in Hollywood, is contagious. Once one person starts booing, the social proof triggers others. The hesitation dissolves. The tension becomes collective. People who might have remained silent are emboldened by the courage, or perceived courage, of those around them. By the time the cameras cut away, the moment had passed, but the meaning had been set. This wasn't just a hiccup. It was a fracture. And fractures are rarely isolated. Because backstage, conversations had already started. Producers discussed narrative damage. Publicists debated strategy. Celebrities whispered about loyalty and risk. And across social media, the moment exploded almost simultaneously, with clips, GIFs, and commentary spreading faster than any official footage could contain. The booing didn't just echo in the auditorium. It reverberated across Hollywood, social media, and public consciousness. It became a cultural touchpoint, a symbol, a reminder that even in spaces engineered for control, human emotion can't be contained. Ask yourself, when is the last time you saw the audience? Not critics in print, not social media debates, but a live, professional audience. Express instantaneous collective judgment that couldn't be redirected or reframed. Rare, isn't it? That's why this moment matters. And yet, the story doesn't end with the boos themselves. The real drama, the emotional stakes, the industry-wide consequences. All of that begins after the cameras cut. Hollywood loves rebels until they stop being profitable. That statement sounds simple, but it captures a truth few want to admit. Celebrity isn't just about talent, influence, or even story. It's about currency. And in Hollywood, currency is measured in attention, goodwill, and, most importantly, profitability. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle entered that ecosystem as outsiders, yes, but outsiders with a story Hollywood could monetize. Royalty rebelling against tradition. A couple claiming agency over their lives and narratives. They were fascinating, marketable, newsworthy, and for a time, the industry loved them for it. But love in Hollywood is conditional. It's transactional. And when the returns diminish or the narrative becomes difficult to manage, admiration can turn cold in a heartbeat. By the time the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards rolled around, signs of that shift were everywhere, if you knew where to look. Projects that had been greenlit months earlier suddenly faced delays. Invitations to gala events became less enthusiastic. Collaborations that seemed assured quietly fell through. And behind the velvet ropes and red carpets, whispers began, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations about audience fatigue, narrative overexposure, and potential backlash filled conference rooms. These weren't idle gossip. They were professional risk assessments. The kind of calculations that can determine whether a show gets made, a deal gets signed, or a publicist even shows up to defend a client. And the tension wasn't one-sided. Harry and Meghan were aware of it. Their team had been monitoring reactions, analyzing media coverage, and preparing for scrutiny. But no strategy can fully protect someone from a live, unpredictable audience, especially one with a collective memory that stretches back years. The irony is stark. Hollywood once celebrated their rebellion, their ability to disrupt tradition. But now, those same qualities were being questioned. Was their independence genuine or performative? Were their projects meaningful contributions or simply extensions of their brand? Had overexposure diluted the novelty that once commanded applause? These questions, floating quietly backstage, became part of the atmosphere in the auditorium that night. Energy is contagious. Suspicion breeds tension. And when you place individuals who embody controversy into a room primed with judgment, the conditions for conflict are set. Let's break down how this tension manifested during the awards themselves. The couple entered the room as expected, polished, poised, and aware of the cameras. Meghan's expression carried the calmness of someone who had rehearsed poise, while Harry's posture betrayed a subtle awareness of the unpredictability around him. The audience, meanwhile, wasn't just watching. They were evaluating. Every movement, every nod, every smile was cataloged and interpreted. The show began. Speeches unfolded. Awards were presented. The expected rhythms of applause, laughter, and recognition flowed. But beneath the surface, undercurrents shifted. The audience's mood was different. Subtle. Hard to detect unless you knew what to look for. Side conversations. Adjusted seating. Quick glances at phones. The kind of silent signals that, in aggregate, can create momentum for a disruptive moment. And then came the trigger, a routine acknowledgement. Nothing controversial in itself, just a line that required recognition. But context had prepared the room. The media storm of the previous days, the slow build-up of scrutiny and fatigue, the quiet reassessment of the couple's status, all coalesced at that instant. The initial murmur of disapproval started small, hesitant. A single voice, then another. And then, like a fuse meeting dry kindling, it ignited. Booing. Not casual, not ironic. Persistent and unmistakable. Enough to catch everyone off guard. The hosts paused, unsure how to respond. The camera operators scrambled to cut away. And Harry and Meghan were left seated, absorbing the shock in real time. Backstage, chaos quietly erupted. Producers recalibrated. Editors prepared contingencies. Publicists assessed potential fallout. But unlike rehearsed moments, this was live. There was no script to follow. No edits that could remove the emotional truth of what had just occurred. It's important to note here that Hollywood's love affair isn't purely about celebrity adoration. It's about control over narratives, reactions, and perception. When audiences assert themselves in a way that breaks that control, it creates panic. And that's exactly what happened. Yet, the couple's response remained composed, strategically measured. Meghan adjusted posture and facial expressions. Harry scanned the room subtly, seeking both support and insight. Every micro-expression mattered. And for viewers watching, it revealed layers of tension that the cameras would only hint at. But the coldness of Hollywood's embrace didn't end with the live reaction. It extended into the following days. Invitations became selective. Opportunities that seemed guaranteed vanished quietly. Insider commentary suggested that some executives viewed the boos not as isolated feedback, but as a warning sign of a shifting cultural tide, one that might affect projects, partnerships, and perceptions for months, even years. This dynamic highlights the paradox of celebrity in Hollywood. On one hand, fame is a shield. On the other, it's a magnifying glass. The more visibility you gain, the more scrutiny is inevitable. And when audience goodwill reaches a tipping point, admiration can sour faster than it was earned. By this point, it wasn't just about the award show. It was about broader questions. Could Harry and Meghan sustain their relevance? Could their narrative still command empathy without backlash? And how much control could anyone have over public perception in a world dominated by instantaneous judgment and viral dissemination? The audience's reaction was a microcosm of this larger tension. The industry could attempt damage control. They could release statements. They could spin clips on social media, but they could not erase the audio of boos, nor the energy shift in that room. The audience had spoken, and the echo of their disapproval would follow long after the night ended. And as the world watched, the question became unavoidable. What comes after the applause dies and the collective judgment of a critical audience takes its place? Because the story doesn't end with the boos. It begins there. The loudest moment was the one you never heard. That's the paradox of live television. What the audience sees is curated. What they hear is filtered. But sometimes, even the best engineering can't contain reality. At the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards, the broadcast cut away just as the boos started swelling. To viewers at home, it looked like an awkward pause. Maybe an editorial decision. Maybe nothing at all. But behind the scenes, the reality was far messier. Sound engineers scrambled. Producers whispered urgently into headsets. Editors prepared emergency cuts. Even a fraction of a second of sustained negative reaction could shift the tone of an entire broadcast. And in Hollywood, tone is everything. Imagine the control room, banks of monitors, operators frantically switching angles, trying to sanitize chaos. One wrong cut, one delayed camera, one microphone left open, and suddenly the unthinkable becomes visible and audible to the world. Meanwhile, in the auditorium, the energy hadn't dissipated. The boos weren't a single sound. They were layered, organic, and contagious. One table starts, another follows, then murmurs swell into audible disapproval. A ripple effect that no broadcast protocol can fully suppress. And then came the subtle, almost imperceptible moments the cameras deliberately avoided. The split-second glances, the tight smiles that faltered, the eyes darting around, assessing the room, reading the crowd. Micro-expressions that telegraphed recognition. We've lost control. Meghan's hands shifted in her lap. Harry's jaw tightened subtly. Not dramatically, but enough for anyone trained in reading body language to sense alarm. These are the moments editors intentionally cut from the live feed. Moments that reveal tension in its rawest form. Producers tried to save the narrative. They pointed cameras elsewhere. They raised microphones to other voices. They accelerated the schedule, hoping to reset the rhythm before the audience could sense panic. But there's a limit to control. Once emotion leaks into a room, the story has left the script. And then the whispers began. Small, quiet, backstage murmurs. Calls over headsets. Urgent messages to stage managers. Did you see that? Keep rolling. Signal security if it escalates. Even minor tremors in decision-making can reveal the human side of industry logistics, the part no one ever sees when the polished broadcast airs. For Harry and Meghan, these invisible disruptions were palpable. They could feel the energy shift, even if the cameras didn't show it. The audience reaction, the half-cuts to other shots, the tension in the room, all signals that the night had deviated from the carefully plotted script. And yet, the couple remained seated, strategically composed. Meghan's expression controlled, poised, yet subtle tension in her eyes betrayed acute awareness. Harry's posture remained alert, scanning the room just enough to gauge reactions without appearing defensive. Every microaction mattered. Every glance carried weight. This is the fascinating part. Hollywood teaches poise. Hollywood teaches control. But it rarely teaches how to respond to collective, live judgment, audience sentiment that refuses to be mediated, filtered, or framed. And in that moment, Harry and Meghan were confronting precisely that, a reality where the audience dictated the narrative, not producers or PR. Then there was the subtle escalation. The booing itself, though briefly audible in the room, had already planted seeds elsewhere. Smartphones were recording. Hidden angles captured glimpses. Social media, always vigilant, amplified small moments before the broadcast could even respond. Clips circulated, conversations ignited, debates started. And the ripple effect had begun before anyone had fully processed the live event. It's important to recognize why this is significant. Live reactions like this are rare. Hollywood audiences are trained to follow etiquette, applause, laughter, polite nods. Even criticism is often veiled, indirect, or deferred. This moment broke that pattern. It wasn't just an audience responding. It was an audience asserting itself, loudly, visibly, in real time. And producers, for all their planning, couldn't contain it. Meanwhile, Back in the control room, the panic was compounded by the fact that no one knew the full extent of the reaction. Microphones captured fragments, cameras cut elsewhere, and producers had to make split-second decisions. Do we continue the show as planned? Do we alter camera angles? Do we provide cutaways or emergency graphics to divert attention? Every decision carried risk. And the tension wasn't limited to the stage or the control room. Backstage, celebrities whispered among themselves. Some attempted to mask surprise with polite applause. Others simply watched, frozen. Security teams maintained distance, unsure if the energy would escalate beyond verbal reactions. Even minor reactions, invisible to the broadcast audience, contributed to a sense of collective uncertainty. This is where narrative control crumbles in subtle ways. While the cameras can cut, the energy cannot. While the microphones can amplify or mute, perception is unavoidable. The room, live and human, holds truths that no post-production edit can erase. For Harry and Meghan, this was the first public exposure to that reality in years. Years of curated appearances, controlled interviews, and meticulously timed media releases had prepared them for scrutiny, but not for live, spontaneous, collective judgment delivered without warning. And then came the subtle, but telling, signals from the audience. Some seats shifted uncomfortably. A few faint chuckles tried to cover tension, but fell flat. Whispered comments traveled faster than anyone realized. Those small moments, amplified by proximity and shared recognition, created an environment of heightened alertness. It's easy to underestimate these invisible moments. But they matter. They shape perception. They determine memory. They influence how the narrative is written after the fact. By the end of the segment, the couple remained composed. The show continued. The cameras cut away strategically. Clips were carefully managed. But the impact lingered. Because while viewers at home might have seen only a polished production, the truth, raw, complex, human, was happening just out of frame. And here's what's crucial. Those off-camera moments are what define the real story. They reveal strategy under pressure, vulnerability under scrutiny, and the fragile boundary between perception and reality. Ask yourself this. How often do we trust the polished moments we see on screen? How often do we forget that what is broadcast is curated, edited, and framed to convey stability, even in chaos? The unrecorded, unseen, and barely audible moments carry the most weight. They reveal truths that no statement, interview, or press release can fully convey. And for Harry and Meghan, those truths were immediate, palpable, and unavoidable. The night's chaos wasn't limited to the stage or control room. Backstage, the energy was suffocating. Producers paced in tight circles, whispering into headsets with the urgency of surgeons in an operating theater. Stage managers adjusted cues, lights flickered as if uncertain, and makeup artists froze mid-brush, sensing the tension before it fully manifested. This wasn't theater. It was a high-stakes live experiment in human behavior. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. Seconds felt like minutes. Conversations happened in rapid-fire whispers, punctuated by nervous laughter that didn't reach anyone's eyes. No one knew how far the booing had penetrated the audience's collective consciousness. No one knew how it would ripple across social media in real time. And it was already spreading. Smartphones, always ready, captured fragments. The first hesitant murmur, the swell into full-blown booing, Harry's split-second glance, Meghan's subtle shift in posture. Clips circulated on encrypted backstage channels first, then leaked to the public almost immediately. Within minutes, hashtags were forming. Discussion threads ignited. Reactions ranged from support to outrage, from bewilderment to schadenfreude. The paradox here is striking. A moment designed to be polished, rehearsed, and controlled was simultaneously escaping every form of control. The live energy of the room collided with the permanence of digital documentation, creating a feedback loop no PR team could contain. Harry and Meghan were acutely aware of it. Every micro-expression, every glance, every subtle movement was a calculation in real time. Meghan's hand rested on her lap, but flexed ever so slightly, an unconscious signal of alertness. Harry's jaw tightened, not enough to be obvious, but enough for anyone reading body language to recognize tension. These were not reactions to boos alone. They were responses to the amplified scrutiny that the room and the digital world projected instantly. Even the people seated nearby felt it. Some tried to cover the tension with polite applause. Others attempted to mask surprise with laughter. But when multiple layers of awareness, camera angles, audience expectations, peer judgment overlap, small gestures become seismic. Every facial twitch, every blink, every shift in posture is amplified by context. And context was everything that night. The Critics' Choice Awards audience wasn't composed of casual viewers. Critics, industry insiders, and seasoned media professionals were watching. These are people trained to read narratives, analyze body language, and detect inconsistencies. Their reactions were informed by years of experience, and the subtlety of their judgment carried weight. A sigh, a shifted gaze, a faint smirk, all of it mattered. Now layer in the psychological dynamics. Social proof, the phenomenon where people follow the actions of others to conform, played a pivotal role. Once the initial boos began, even those who might have stayed silent felt emboldened. The tipping point had been reached. One table led, and others followed. The murmurs became audible. The audience collectively signaled, "We are in charge here." Backstage, this created a surreal tension. Producers, used to orchestrating every beat, suddenly found themselves spectators to a narrative spiraling beyond their control. Editors whispered into headsets, "Prepare backup coverage." Directors adjusted camera angles. Everyone knew this wasn't just a moment. It was a potential crisis. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan's composure became the anchor. They remained seated, their reactions measured but palpable. Meghan's slight tightening of her lips, the subtle raise of an eyebrow, Harry's scanning gaze, all communicated awareness and resilience without overt emotion. These micro-moments revealed psychological strategy in action: maintain poise, assess environment, prepare for escalation. Yet even with this discipline, tension is contagious. Nearby celebrities shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to support, ignore, or counterbalance the energy. The audience's dynamic had transformed from passive observation to active participation. And once a crowd moves collectively, control is virtually impossible. And then came the digital amplification. Smartphones in the room captured moments that cameras avoided. Clips circulated online before producers could respond. The internet, as always, acted faster than reality. The booing, subtle backstage reactions, and expressions of tension became viral fragments, interpreted, debated, and analyzed globally. The narrative had escaped the room entirely. Here's what makes this so consequential: live reactions are rare. Backstage, everyone involved knows that what unfolds in front of the camera is carefully curated. The polished feed masks chaos, uncertainty, and human error. But when off-camera reality collides with live perception, it exposes truths that no editing can obscure. For Harry and Meghan, this exposure was immediate, unfiltered, and inescapable. Moreover, the night illuminated a crucial aspect of fame. Vulnerability is unavoidable when control is lost. Even years of experience navigating media scrutiny cannot shield someone from a live audience's collective judgment. In that moment, curated public identity meets raw human emotion. And the collision is seismic. The psychological stakes were heightened by several invisible factors. First, proximity. Sitting amid peers and critics, fully aware that every glance and expression could be read and judged, creates an intensified emotional environment. Second, history. This couple's story had been repeatedly dissected, debated, and commodified. Every nuance mattered. Every micro-expression carried interpretive weight. Third, expectation. They were expected to handle scrutiny with grace, to embody resilience, to maintain narrative control, standards that create immense internal pressure. And all of that tension came to a head in the small, almost imperceptible moments the cameras cut, the side glances, the subtle shifts, the micro-adjustments. These invisible signals revealed as much, if not more, than the audible boos themselves. By the end of the segment, the couple's composure had stabilized the immediate visual narrative, but the emotional reverberations remained. Backstage whispers grew, digital fragments circulated, and social media exploded. The moment, though brief, had lasting consequences. It highlighted a critical truth: Celebrity and control are conditional. Audience perception can't be fully scripted. Narrative authority is fleeting. And in an ecosystem built on polished appearances, a single unscripted disruption can reveal vulnerabilities previously hidden. The evening wasn't just disrupted. It was a demonstration of how fragile curated celebrity narratives can be. Harry and Meghan maintained poise, but the system around them had already been shaken. The cameras could cut, the microphones could mute, but the human reality, emotional, chaotic, contagious, had left its mark. And that mark would shape the fallout for weeks, months, and perhaps years. Because in Hollywood, moments like this are not forgotten. They are analyzed, interpreted, and leveraged. They inform decisions about invitations, collaborations, media coverage, and brand perception. The aftermath of the booing was immediate, but its consequences unfolded over hours, days, and eventually, weeks. The moment the cameras cut away, the production team exhaled, or at least tried to. But the reality backstage was anything but calm. Producers huddled in small circles, whispering urgently into headsets, their voices tight with the kind of controlled panic that only comes when a live broadcast spirals in an unexpected direction. Editors prepared emergency cuts and alternative camera angles, while stage managers checked cues and light cues as if one misstep could make the entire event collapse. Harry and Meghan remained seated, their composure intact but their awareness heightened. Meghan's eyes flicked briefly toward the nearest cameras, gauging what had been captured. Harry's posture shifted subtly, signaling a readiness to react to both the immediate audience and the larger implications. Their bodies spoke volumes even as their faces remained calm, micro-expressions hinting at tension, alertness, and careful calculation. Backstage, the ripple effect was palpable. Celebrities nearby whispered among themselves, some visibly uncomfortable, others caught between amusement and incredulity. Production assistants adjusted equipment nervously. Security subtly shifted positions, aware that the emotional temperature in the room had spiked, even if no physical threat existed. The energy in the room was electric, and it pulsed through every corner of the auditorium. And then there was the digital dimension. Social media had already begun to respond before the night had even officially progressed. Smartphone footage, initially captured by audience members on their phones, spread across private networks and was quickly amplified online. Clips of the boos, combined with close-ups of Harry and Meghan's subtle reactions, became instant fodder for commentary, debate, and speculation. Within minutes, hashtags emerged. Threads on Twitter, Instagram stories, and TikTok compilations fueled conversations that the live broadcast could not contain. The nature of this digital amplification is crucial to understand. Unlike the live audience, which could be partially guided by camera cuts and production interventions, online audiences are autonomous. They interpret, analyze, and assign meaning without the constraints of etiquette, decorum, or production influence. The live, physical booing became a catalyst for a much larger wave of public discussion, one that extended far beyond the walls of the venue. For Harry and Meghan, this presented a multi-layered challenge. They were confronting a real-time public judgment in the room while simultaneously navigating the anticipatory and immediate fallout in the digital sphere. Every movement, glance, or shift in posture was scrutinized, interpreted, and often misinterpreted. The psychological stakes were enormous. The need to maintain composure in a volatile room, to anticipate audience perception, and to manage a rapidly proliferating digital narrative, all while under the relentless gaze of critics, colleagues, and the broader public. Meanwhile, the industry's response was measured but calculated. Public relations teams began formulating responses, carefully choosing which moments to highlight and which to downplay. Statements were crafted with precision, balancing acknowledgement of the incident with strategic deflection. Executives, aware of the potential implications for ongoing and future projects, convened private meetings to assess risk, reputational impact, and potential strategies for narrative control. Within these conversations, several key themes emerged. First, the recognition that live reactions, especially negative ones, carry far more weight than curated, post-produced narratives. Second, the understanding that audience perception, once crystallized in a moment of visible and audible judgment, cannot be fully reversed. Third, the realization that the digital ecosystem had transformed how events like this are consumed, interpreted, and remembered. A boo in a live auditorium now becomes an enduring artifact, accessible globally, and replayed countless times, each iteration reinforcing or reshaping public sentiment. The psychological impact on Harry and Meghan was compounded by the social dynamics within the room. Colleagues and peers were forced to navigate their own reactions carefully, balancing personal opinions with professional expectations. Supportive gestures were limited by the need to maintain decorum, while neutral expressions were read as disapproval. In this environment, even minor cues, such as a subtle nod, a half-smile, or a brief eye contact, were magnified, contributing to a complex web of perceived allegiances and judgments. Additionally, the incident highlighted the inherent tension between celebrity persona and human vulnerability. Despite years of media